Okay, so now I'm going to talk a little bit about some other tensions around national parks. Again, because these are, as much as we sort of talk about nature as like this blank slate that we can write whatever we want on, that's not really how it works. There's a lot of other sort of tensions and other factors that affect this. So, and some of these I've already sort of mentioned. I just want to sort of pull them together so that you guys understand that um, as a nation building project, there are very much still tensions around the idea of national parks in terms of what happens in that. So, one of them, for example, is the tension about preservation versus tourism. Because if you understand, like, if you conceptualize the national parks as exclusively a form of nature preserve, then what you want for those parks is for them to be as inaccessible to humans as possible. You do not want hikers, you do not want roads, you certainly don't want hotels, you definitely do not want Wi-Fi access, you don't want to have people building ski hills, you don't want to do any of those things, because all of them are going to disrupt habitat, are going to disrupt migration patterns, are going to sort of destabilize ecosystems. That is what you want. So I mean, if you want that, what you basically want is like, yeah, so we built this national park and then we surrounded it with 100,000 acres of forest. The only way to get through is to walk, and that is a great way of protecting that as sort of a pure nature preserve. If what you want is to sort of create something that is going to be a tourist attraction, and is going to provide like pleasant experiences for visitors, then you're looking at very, very, very different things, right? If you want to attract the largest possible number of visitors, you want lots of options for hotels. You want you want good, smooth roads that are pretty straight, take you pretty much everywhere, so that you can drive to the hike base. You want, for example, hiking trails that are paved so you can take them in a stroller or a wheelchair. You want to talk about Wi-Fi, you're talking about grocery services, you're talking about building good sewer treatment plants, you're looking at sort of ensuring that there's restaurants, that there's maybe a spa, a movie theater, all kinds of things like that to sort of satisfy that tourist urge. And you definitely want the ski hills, especially in the mountains, because they sort of, people will come for that reason. And it very quickly becomes apparent that if you only have so much land set aside, those two purposes are, relatively speaking, in conflict, because one of them is sort of a lot of human intervention in that sort of supposedly natural space, and the other is sort of attempting to minimize it. So there's that tension that sort of underlies all of this. And it's a challenging one to navigate, because one of the things that it's important for you to remember is that there are people who live in the national parks all the time. Like, there are people whose hometown is Jasper. There are people whose hometown is Banff. And what they need and what tourists need are also somewhat different. So there's a lot of sort of tension in that, especially because all of the sort of rules for national parks are not actually set at the sort of local level. They're set by the federal government. So if you want to pass a no idling bylaw in a national park, you got to go through Ottawa to do it. So there's that piece, but we also have sort of some tensions around ownership and sort of what that looks like when we talk about Indigenous issues, right? Like the rest of the country, national parks are fundamentally Indigenous or treaty lands, depending on how you want to think about it, okay? And that creates some interesting sort of, again, tensions because around what you want to do with the space, because similar to what we talked about when we sort of talked about Oka and how initially there was sort of like a technical level of conflict between the Mohawk and the municipality of Oka. But when what the municipality of Oka wanted to do with the land was like, yeah, it's a park. So we put in like a small parking lot and some porta potties. That doesn't create significant tension with Indigenous populations, because that kind of use is not likely to disrupt, for example, their ability to harvest medicines, their ability to walk in the woods, their ability to sort of experience this in ways that are relevant to their own spirituality. And back after that brief interruption due to the toddler in the house. So, We're going to talk a little bit about sort of what that looks like. So one of the contemporary discussions around, for example, national parks is around the development of ski hills, because in a lot of ways, indigenous groups who sort of are looking to be able to access sacred sites, and ski hills are looking for the same places, right? If you're running a high-end mountain ski hill, what you want um, is the most beautiful vistas for people coming down that run. You want it to be gorgeous. Um, but in order to do that, you're sort of talking about manipulating spaces, and you're talking about cutting lift lines and having snow grooming equipment, and ideally you want the perfect little like restaurant at the top so people can sit down and have lunch. You want to sort of put in all of those infrastructure pieces. And that is a challenge if you have indigenous groups or indigenous people who say that makes it impossible for us to use the land in ways that are consistent with our spiritual traditions for us to meet our needs on this land. So there's some tension around that, in terms of the question. There's also, we haven't done a ton of this in this class, although we could. We haven't done a ton of discussion about socioeconomic status and socioeconomic divisions, but that's also a really, really, really important part of understanding national parks in sort of a broader context of how we talk about Canadian identity. So this is probably not going to be a surprise to most of you, but the vast majority of people who use national parks, or actually, no, this probably might surprise some of you. It's not an even utilization of national park systems. The people who use national parks, and especially the people who use the national parks most frequently, are disproportionately wealthy and they are disproportionately white. Which means that we're talking about these as national resources for all Canadians, but the people who actually go and actually sort of experience these ideas tend to be from the most advantaged groups in society, both racially and economically. And there's a number of pieces that kind of intertwine about that. First of all, for those of you who have ever done it, visiting the national parks can be really expensive, because hotels are expensive and food is expensive and that kind of thing. And being able to get access to that on top of having the availability of sort of vacation time can be a challenge for people who are sort of making less money. And the way that our society is structured, the people making less money are disproportionately likely to be visible minorities, so there's a piece sort of in that. That's actually one of the reasons why they made the Parks Passes free in 2017 for the 150th birthday, because the idea was to sort of remove cost as a barrier, except that sort of doesn't, it's a step, but it doesn't recognize where a lot of those costs really are. So an annual Parks Pass is less than $200 a year. But, and you know, it is important, and that can be a valuable cost that prevents people from going to see the national parks. But if you want to get to most of them, you are either looking at doing a really, really, really long day. So either Banff or Jasper is about 4 hours away from from Edmonton, and you could do that as a day trip. I have done it, but it's a long day to do it that way. And if you want to stay overnight, then you're looking at, okay, well, what are we paying in hotel costs? And that is $300-400 a night, and then you have to have meals and you have to have the vacation time. Like this, the $200 Parks Pass is not the largest cost here, and that's before you start talking about activities in the national parks, right? Having equipment to be available to go skiing, have lift tickets, that kind of thing. Whether we're talking about camping gear, we're talking about outdoor clothing, even something as simple as a good winter jacket that you can sort of use to walk in the parks, it can be a challenge for some people because they can be quite expensive. So there's that kind of economic divide as well that sort of is an ongoing consideration we've had in our discussion about Canadian identity, right? In that this is a policy that looks neutral on the surface, but is actually connected to a number of sort of disparities underneath. The other thing that we should sort of talk about too is that we talk about a national parks system, right? As though the national parks are sort of even meaningfully similar. And they're not. Part of that is sheer geography. So I have numbers from I think 2016 in front of me, so I will use them, but they haven't meaningfully changed in terms of what I'm trying to explain here. Um, some national parks are accessed by a lot of people. So in 2016, my data, like the numbers I have in front of me, says that Banff got about 3.8 million visitors. Many of them are traveling internationally, coming from other countries in the world just to see the Rocky Mountains. Okay, so that's one extreme of sort of what this looks like. Um, but not all the national parks in the country, are even remotely close to that. So the sort of counterexample I want to give you is a national park called Tukut Nagoyat, and I may have said that wrong because I do not speak Dene. But it's in the Northwest Territories, all the way north of the Arctic Circle. And I pulled numbers for the same year, and in 2016 it got 4 visitors. So Banff, quite honestly, almost gets a million times more visitors as this national park. Partially because in that national park you have to pack everything in and pack everything out, and the only way to access it is by helicopter. Um, there is no Wi-Fi, there's no hotels, there's nothing. So if you're not an experienced sort of backcountry camper and hiker, this is not the park for you. Um, on top of that, it can be really chilly. It's not sort of, the climate is not the kind of thing of like, yes, millions of people around the world want to go do that. Um, but that means that as much as we talk about these tensions about economic viability and tourism versus nature, and sort of indigenous use and non-indigenous use, it's also important to understand that that whole spectrum is actually represented even within our national park system. Especially when you start thinking about the fact that the national park system includes some very, very weird things um, that don't sort of seem like parks. They just got placed in the national park system for its own, for like other reasons. So one example is a place called in Charlottetown, Prince Edward Island, called Province House. And this is like in the middle of downtown Charlottetown, and I think there's, like a relatively large suburban house lot full of gardens. It's not a natural area at all, but it's under the National Park Service because Province House is where Confederation was signed in 1864, and there was sort of a need to preserve that as a national monument, and that got pulled into the park system as well. So when we start talking about these ideas of nation building projects, and there are lots of other examples we could talk about, I just sort of wanted to give you some examples. One of the things that it's important to understand is that none of them are complete. They always have these sort of quirks about who's running it and what else is attached to that, and what are the tensions around that. Um, and we have, as a country, Canada has absolutely not solved that nation building problem. We're still sort of trying to figure out what it means to attempt to build a nation, to build a sort of stable political and economic entity from the various forms of diversity that we have in this country.